Okay, I got a special request from a gentleman I never can say no to. So we'll start this a little bit differently than some of the other programs. And it's all part of the introduction also. Hine ma tovu manayim shevet achim gam yachad. Hine ma tovu manayim shevet achim gam yachad. Behold how wonderful friends to be together. Behold how beautiful friends to be together. Hine ma tovu manayim shevet achim gam yachad. How good, how wonderful friends to be together. So that was my request from Gary Evans, and I never say no to Gary Evans. And it's all related to this day's contents, which I don't like to do. This is not my favorite lecture. By the way, where's Bill Kelleher? There's Bill Kelleher. Bill Kelleher sent me a book last year, which I'm right in the middle of. Here you go. Okay. So this lecture is because of Sherry Jones. Okay? Sherry, Sherry, baby. So Sherry tells me I have to give this lecture last year, and I said, I don't like to give, you have to give this lecture. So here we are, this is me at graduation this year with one of my best recent friends, Father Charlie. And what is not showing is that on the other side of Charlie, we're saying goodbye to Charlie. We still don't have a priest, as far as I know, for this year's class. And the single largest number of students at Lafayette College today are Catholic. But the diocese is in so much difficulty, we don't know what's happening in the fall yet. But on the other side is Reverend John. I called John up on the other side. And at the end of the service, also, our Muslim chaplain, Javad Tavakoli, came up with another Hillel member, and we had this wonderful going away. We totally surprised Father Charlie 4 times in his departure this year, 4 separate times, the first of which was Passover Seder, and he's been coming to our Seders for the last 12, 15 years. And we got him a beautiful Lafayette watch at the Passover Seder. We got him a good 12-pack of wine, a case of wine to go away, Steve Lammers and myself. So we really sent him off well. How does it relate to this talk? About 10, 12 years, Father Charlie comes into my office. I even know when it is. It's February the 10th, 2001, with a book called Constantine's Sword. How many of you know this book at all? Anyone know this book? Carol was an ex-priest, now married, still very, very Catholic, who wrote this powerful, powerful book about Christian anti-Semitism. And Father walks into my office, gives me this book, and he's got tears in his eyes. And he says to me, I knew it was bad, but I didn't know it was this bad. So what I'm going to do for the first discussion is talk about Christian-Jewish relations all the way up until the 19th century, because you can't understand the Holocaust without that discussion if you want to understand it globally. If you're talking about the perfect storm, part of the perfect storm takes 1,000 years to develop at least. And then part of the perfect storm, the background of the Holocaust, is about the late 19th and first half of the 20th century. Christianity does not cause the Holocaust, but without the conflict between Christianity and Judaism, the Holocaust doesn't make any sense at all. It wouldn't have happened unless there was something else that replaced it equally deep. And there was almost nothing equally that deep except what's now developing into the Muslim-Jewish conflict over time, which is really, really a devastating development. So in preparation for this talk, what do I usually do? I usually do more reading. So here we have a Catholic interpretation. Here we have the newest Jewish interpretation of Christian-Jewish relations by a scholar from Oxford who has established a Jewish-Christian Institute in, is it Oxford or Cambridge? Cambridge. And it's a wonderful, wonderful book. So I went through this in the last month, and that's where your chronology comes from. And what I did is I've got my own, you can see, I don't read books. I devour books. Okay, you go over it once or twice, and then you really, really make it your own. And then what happens, we got to let the Protestants in. I mean, you know, there's got to be some room for Protestants. Not in my school. It was all Catholic and Jewish. I had one Protestant friend. He converted to Judaism. And because he took off on all of our holidays, right? All right, so this is the newest thing by a Protestant. And what I did is check all the major places to verify what the current interpretations are. This came out about 4 months ago, and it's exactly the same. All of these books have exactly the same interpretation. In the ancient world, there was some animus toward Jews and Judaism in the Greek and Roman world. It was mostly because of the Jews' unwillingness to pray to Roman gods, to pray, to worship the emperors. It was because of their tradition of law or Torah, their dietary restrictions, which sometimes made them look unsocial. There was also a lot of respect for Jews in the Roman world. And as long as Jews did not rebel, they generally had even a semi-privileged situation in the Roman world. They were not forced generally to bow down, and their religious sites generally were respected. Now, what most people don't realize about the Jews in the ancient time period is that they were also a very rebellious people. They drove themselves almost into disappearance by rebelling against the far superior Roman strength, especially any time the Romans would desecrate Jewish holy places, put idols in them, or anything like that. So in the year 70 of what Jews call the Common Era and Christians call the Christian Era, we don't even use the same calendars, okay? The temple is destroyed. And most of the Jews are expelled from Jerusalem. It's at that time, now that is about 40 years after the death of Christ. It's at that time that Christianity is germinating and becoming a religion separate from Judaism. Virtually all the apostles are Jews using Jewish languages in a Jewish cultural milieu, arguing over ultimate meaning. And there were many, many, many sects of the Jews. So that today, when all of this has been studied and restudied as a result of World War II and the Holocaust, most of the churches, at least in the West, consider Judaism to be a sibling religion, either a father religion or a mother religion or a sibling religion out of the same trunk. Most of the Gospels, except for Paul, are written just after the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans. And all of these books agree that the Gospels are written from that perspective by people who didn't see the crucifixion because they weren't there. The crucifixion occurs in 33. Paul converts in 35. Paul's name is Saul of Tarsus. And all the other Gospels are written between 80 and 100 and afterwards, after the destruction of Jerusalem at the hands of the Romans. And the Jews and the Christians are still competing for space, for people. And most of the Christians are still practicing Judeo-Christianity, celebrating Jewish holidays, speaking the Jewish religion. Paul is the one who essentially takes a modified Judaism out to the Gentiles. And the most important things he changes are Christological, the messianicship of Christ, and the lack of necessity, because the Messiah has come, to no longer observe the dietary laws and all of the restrictions of ancient Judaism. And what is the third? I had it a minute ago, but I lost it. It's a biggie. Circumcision. So, in any competition between Jews and Christians in the early period, and Jews were still doing pretty good, they were at a disadvantage because of these restrictive dietary laws and circumcision. So Paul and later Muhammad take the root of Judaism and spread it globally. The concept of one God. The most important differential, however, is whether or not Christ is Messiah. The Jews rejected that and they were all waiting for a Messiah. Messianism was very, very widespread at that time. But their Messiah was supposed to bring an era of peace, and they didn't notice any peace. What they noticed was the destruction of their temple. So what did the Jews do about it? Well, 60, 70 years later, nudniks. Does anyone know what a nudnik is? A numbskull. The nudnik Jews, 60, 70 years later, rebel again. Because the Romans again pass laws that they don't like. And they think their Messiah has come. He's a general, son of a star, Bar Kokhba. They rebel again from 132 to 135. And this time the Romans come in and they devastate the land. They devastate the land. At that time, most people who live in what is now Palestine, however, are still Jews, and will remain so for several centuries thereafter. Now, what happens during this time period is that Jews and Christians live side by side, and there were even groups called Judeo-Christians. And as the church becomes an institution, it's concerned about slippage back and forth and the lack of clear boundaries. And so at places like the Council of Nicaea, in 325, the holidays between Judaism and Christianity are separated. Most early Christians also celebrated Passover, as many Christians today have once again come to celebrate Passover, either in their churches or with Jewish friends. Our Seder on campus brings in about 140 people from every religious community, even Muslims. And it's beautiful. Now, at the same time, Christians are angry with Jews for not accepting the new covenant, Christ the Redeemer, the Savior, salvation, and in the Gospels, together with lots of positive things about Judaism, especially in Paul, are deep anti-Jewish statements, the most important of which, of course, is that the Jews killed Christ. They are deicides. They have not only not accepted the Messiah, they have killed the Messiah. All of these books agree that the overwhelming likelihood, as much as we can possibly know, is that in fact Pontius Pilate, who was a very, very strong and nasty fellow, did the deed himself. Some Jews were involved, but no one could have written at that time that the Romans killed Christ and still have survived, because the Romans controlled the whole area. So the sister religion was blamed for the deed of both not accepting the new truth and destroying God. Jews and Christians live alongside each other, by and large, reasonably well for the next 500-600 years. But in the major Christian statements of the greats, like St. Augustine and John Chrysostom, although there are statements that say that Jews should be protected, there are statements of Jews as deicides and of lesser than, and it becomes deeply embedded in the Christian tradition. In the early 4th century, the Roman Emperor Constantine converts to Christianity, after which the state becomes officially a Christian state. The state religion is Christianity. And therefore, the Jews are lesser than. Sometimes protected, sometimes attacked, but always lesser than deicides, rejectors of the true faith, kept alive in their lesser status to prove the truth of the Christian experience, and they will all convert when Christ returns. That will be a sign of the return of the Messiah, the conversion of everyone to Christianity. Well, guess what? That's the Jewish concept of the Messiah also. On that day the Lord shall be one, and his name shall be one, and the Jewish God will become supreme over all the earth. Okay? So each has its own reading of eschatology, the end of days. As late, yeah.
Does the Jewish diaspora occur at the Second Roman Rebellion?
Even earlier, 2,500 years ago, and I'm going to get to that when we talk about how the Jews survive. Okay? Even as late as Charlemagne, Emperor of France and Germany, brings rabbis to the court to teach. Jews are still allowed to bear arms. Jews are still allowed to own land throughout Europe. Jews, there are Roman Jews who trace their ties to Rome back 2,200 years. Jews went with Caesar to Gaul. Their roots in all of these areas are long and long and long and deep. The latest was England. They went over with William the Conqueror in 1066. The stronger the papacy becomes, the rougher it is for the Jews overall. But then you get this major turning point, and that is the Crusades. 1095, 1096, reconquer the Holy Land for Christ, get rid of all these barons who were killing each other all over the place and messing up Europe. Let them play elsewhere. Why go all the way to Palestine to fight the heathen when the heathen live next door and you may even owe them money? So Jews are ravaged all over Europe during the time of the Crusades. Even when the papacy and many of the priests try to protect them, they're ravaged by the mobs. Whole communities are destroyed in Germany, the Rhineland, France. And there, a tradition of Kiddush Hashem develops. Jewish martyrdom, the willing to die rather than convert. And Jews tried to defend themselves as best as they could, but they were a small minority in all of these areas. We're now moving into the real feudal period, the real medieval period. The whole feudal system is based upon Christian oaths of loyalty. Jews cannot be really an inherent part of that economic system. Little by little by little, they lose the right to carry weapons. They lose the right to own land. They lose the right to join in any union confraternities. They lose the right to practice many, many trades. They become the property of the kings and the barons. And it is then that they go into money lending, early banking, and mostly small crafts for the next 500-600 years, because they are not part of the feudal system. They exist on the whim of the monarch. They exist on the whim of the church. The single church that at the same time persecutes and tries to destroy any heresies from within its own midst, and sometimes is worse to other heretics than it is to Jews, because heresy prevents salvation of anyone by polluting the cultural environment and the quest for ultimate reality, which is the life after. The most important thing for most people during the medieval time period was not, what do I eat tonight? Gee whiz, is Shabbos over now so I can have non-kosher food? I mean, no, it's getting to heaven. The ultimate life is the afterlife. This is so powerful that we can't even begin to comprehend it. However, having separated totally from the Jewish community and having participated in what was already mass murder, the stereotypes of the Jews become worse and worse and worse. So in the 12th century, starting in England, we get the blood libel. Anyone know what the blood libel is? You take little Christian children, chop them up, take the blood, you make matzah. Now, I stopped doing that a long time ago because it spoils the taste. That's the blood libel. I have a Russian friend who was a computer expert, came here 15 years ago. Boris. Before Boris led his group, his co-workers said to him, Boris, you're leaving, so it doesn't matter. Will you tell us the truth? Do you still use Christian blood to make matzah? We're talking about the 20th century. Okay? And there are places in the world where this is still believed, and it's one of the canards that now spreads through the Muslim world. So Jews use blood. The middle of the 14th century, you have the Black Death, 1348 to 1351. A third to a half of the Christian population dies as a result of plague. The Jews are poisoning the wells. Now they're dying too. The Jews are poisoning the wells. Bloodsucker, well poisoner, usurer, all the negative stereotypes, until by the 15th century, the Jews take on the image of Satan The synagogue of Satan, that can be found in the New Testament. Okay? The Jews take on the image of Satan with horns. Antichrist. Medieval Christians believed that the Antichrist lived. The Jews were the Antichrist. The Jew becomes the devil in the popular European imagination of the 14th and the 15th century. Anything that is wrong in society is the cause of the Jews. That's how they get back at us for the way they happen to be treated. 1516, ghettos in Venice. Jews know what ghettos are. Between the 16th century and the 19th century, in Western Europe, they were forced to live in walled-in places. They were allowed out during the day. They had to go back at night. If they were caught outside the ghetto, too bad. All their goods would be confiscated and they're in jail. The ghetto of Rome is not destroyed until 1870 with the unification of Italy against the wishes of the papacy, because the Jews have to be separate from other people. And what begins to happen at the same time as well, with a search for purity of religion and the desire to confiscate Jewish money, is that in 1290 all the Jews are expelled from England. In 1306 they're expelled from France. The country needs them, so it calls them back, and in 1384 they're finally expelled again. In 1492 they're expelled from Spain. In 1496 they're expelled from Portugal. There are hundreds of expulsions from cities in Germany. They're still allowed to live in Italy. They sometimes serve as the doctor to the Pope or the Hebrew teacher to priests. Right? So this is massive repression. This is the time of the Renaissance. Biblical scholarship begins again. Return to the original text begins again. Return to the classics begin again. Jews are actually cultural leaven between the Muslim and the Christian world. They were actually living much more safely under the Muslims for much of this time. But they were the conduit of ancient civilization between the Muslim and the Christian world. From the Renaissance comes the Reformation. Luther, 1517, the 95 Theses. And Luther writes a pamphlet that is pro-Jewish. By his way of thinking, he can understand everything that has happened to the Jews. He is here's that Jesus Christ was born a Jew. Wow! Now they had totally de-Judaicized Christ. Christ had become like an Aryan. I mean, I grow a beard, I scare myself, I look in the mirror. I'm serious. Okay? That Jesus Christ was born a Jew. That really means something. Of course, they didn't accept the papacy. He didn't accept the papacy. So they were right. And he goes to them and he says, "Now, kind people, I bring you the good news with love." With love, the way many people said it should be brought. And the Jews say, "Thank you. And we're really glad that everything is happening in such a nice way, but we have our own religion." And 20 years later, Luther writes another pamphlet on the Jews and their lies. And he says, yeah, it's bad. That's why I don't like to give this lecture. He says what? He says, burn their synagogues, burn their Talmud, make them work with the sweat of their nose. When you lay eyes or think of a Jew, you must say to yourself, alas, that mouth which I there behold has cursed and execrated and maligned every Saturday, my dear Lord Jesus Christ. Please before God that I and my wife and my children and all Christians might be stabbed to death. When gangrene has set in, it proceeds without mercy. If this does not help, we must drive them out like mad dogs. Now let everyone see to this I'm exonerated. They must be forbidden to teach, houses be razed, usury prohibited, sweat of their brow, set fire to their synagogues, set fire to their books. Okay. So what happens is at this point where in Protestantism the road could have turned, it doesn't turn, but it does turn. It doesn't turn immediately, although the Puritans are much more Old Testament oriented and they feel much closer to the Jews. So in England and Holland, where there's more Puritanism, Jews by the end of the 17th century are accepted back, especially in Holland, because the Dutch are anti-Catholic. The Dutch Protestants fight the Catholic Spanish. The Jews are welcome. The English Protestants fight the Catholic Spanish, the Armada, the papacy. The Jews are again welcome. Can build synagogues again. Wow. In the immediate sense, Lutheranism brings anti-Semitism into Germany with total force. But by breaking up the unity of Christianity, it makes possible the beginning of a sense of toleration. Why? The Catholics do their very, very best to destroy the Protestants. When the Catholics capture a Protestant town, usually they destroy it, they rape, they pillage, they take. When the Protestants capture a Catholic town, same story. If you know your Irish history, Oliver Cromwell, the saint who allows the Jews back into England, goes to Ireland and he says, give up, give up, give up, and the Catholics won't give up. He says, you are Satan. And he kills every man, woman, and child in Drugda and Wexford, even as he allows the Jews back into England. The Catholics are the Antichrist. The Catholics are the devil. To the Catholics, the Protestants are the devil. Okay. It goes on for 150 years. During the 30 Years' War in Germany, again, half of Europe almost is destroyed. In Germany especially. 30% of the population minimally, maybe more, is killed during the religious wars. So by the end of the 17th century, some people begin looking this way and begin looking that way. I don't know what God is. I don't know where God is, but I know that this isn't godly. So you get Montaigne in France. You get John Locke in England. There's a lot of attorneys in this room. The American Constitution comes from John Locke. Life, liberty, and property. Religious toleration. We make it pursuit of happiness. To the Brits, it's the rights of property. Don't tax me too much. Locke writes a book, an essay on the reasonableness of Christianity. Protestantism is the best religion, but don't persecute anybody else based on the religion. People are to be treated based on how they behave, not how they believe. Okay. From Locke and others comes the French Enlightenment of Voltaire and Diderot and Robespierre and all of those other people. Comes the American Revolution, comes the French Revolution, comes the beginning of modern nationalism, and it is during the French Revolution that for the first time Jews become really legally accepted in France once again from the last 500 years and are made full citizens on the condition that they accept France as their nation. Judaism is no longer their nation. Judaism is their faith. It is their religion. But they are like Frenchmen of any other kind. There was no popular referendum on this. It became law. In America, if there had been a popular referendum, I think it probably would have passed at that time. In France, I'm sure it wouldn't have. Okay? Because all of these anti-Jewish stereotypes remained in the masses, remained in the minds of anyone who was illiterate. And most people were illiterate for another 100 years. You can't just snap a finger and change a whole culture. Oh, the middle class and the elites had modernized over time, but the overwhelming majority of the population, no. In Russia, 80% of the population was illiterate until the end of the 19th century and still believed in all of these ancient medieval stereotypes. But now the Jews become equal citizens in America and in France. And every time a new constitution and a new nation is born in Europe in the 19th century, part of its new constitution includes religious toleration and equality for other groups. Jews get equality in Germany in 1867, 1870, when Germany gets a new constitution as a new nation. Same thing happens in Italy in 1870 when the ghetto is destroyed. Napoleon literally destroyed the ghettos when he conquered Europe. And when he was defeated, they put the damn ghettos back up again. Okay? So, let's see. Where should we go at this point? How did the Jews survive? How much time do I have? When do we officially end this session and take a break? 3 o'clock. Okay, I want to leave you time for questions. Okay. All right, so I'm going to take it further then. The 19th century is the century of modernization. The 19th century is the century of urbanization. The 19th century is the century of education and literacy. The 19th century is the century in which Jews get equal opportunity, and they are prototypically a more modern people and a more urban people, primarily because their tradition has so much emphasis on reading, literacy, and text learning, and also because many of their trades had been associated with commerce and money from the medieval period forward. They modernize faster than any other ethnic group, no matter where they go. Doesn't matter whether it's America, Germany, Russia, France, England. 100 years later, almost all of them are middle and upper middle class, and some are fantastically wealthy, whenever they're allowed any level of equality. Now, my ancestors in Poland and Russia, when they came here after World War I, were impoverished because they weren't allowed equality in Poland and Russia. Okay. But still, even in Poland and Russia, in the big cities, the Jews dominated urban economic life in Poland and Russia. They built Warsaw, they built Białystok, they built Vilna, the industry, the railroads. They were willing to take more risks because they had been kept out of everything. They learned survival techniques. My PhD was written about a French ambassador, Catholic, liberal, well-educated, urbane. He called the Jews tenacious and cunning, like those of their race. He liked them because they were well-educated, okay? He liked them by and large. He liked to be with them. But he stereotyped them anyway. He stereotyped them. They are bewitched by money, and marriage is a sale. Then his first secretary in the embassy gets engaged, and what is the first question that Paul Cambon asks his first secretary? What is the wealth of your bride? So when a Jew does it, it's greed. But when a good, intelligent, common sense Catholic does it, it's common sense. How much money does the bride's family have? Okay, but for Jews, marriage is a sale. In other words, a lot of the stereotypes stay regardless of the sense of equality, And not everybody liked the French Revolution, and not everybody liked the changes. And sadly, among the groups that disliked the changes the most, unfortunately, was the Catholic Church. Protestants didn't like them too much also, but they may do better. The hierarchy despised modernity, despised urban life, despised freedom of education, despised critical reading of texts. So that what you get, and this is so tragic, what you get is, for example, the Syllabus of Errors in 1864. Pius IX is against the creation of the Italian state. The state takes away Vatican land. The Syllabus of Errors. What are errors? I give it to my students to read. They read it and they say, oh, the Pope agreed with all of these things. And I said, what's the title? Syllabus of Errors. That equal education, that democracy, that secularism, that state control, that religious toleration are errors. Okay? You get your first liberal pope, Leo XIII, between 1878 to 1891. I consider him to be a liberal pope. My Catholic liberal colleagues are furious with him because even he doesn't go for toleration. Okay? I consider him to be a liberal pope because he says to the wealthy, you better pay a fair wage. He fears socialism, he fears unions, but he says to the wealthy, you better pay a fair wage. That is your Catholic responsibility. And he also says it's okay to vote for a republic. You don't have to be a monarchist. So the church and the monarchy and the nobility was like this. And the middle class was generally Republican and for political systems like the American or the British or the French political system. Monarchy is still the largest form of government in Europe until after World War I, and all the churches are linked with the monarchs. And every time you get liberal priests, they're told to keep quiet or risk. In other words, folks, I'm not talking about your priests, and I'm not talking about your pope. I'm talking about pre-World War II, before Vatican II, before Nostra Aetate in 1965, that said everyone is responsible for the death of Christ, and Christianity must respect all other religious traditions. Perhaps the single two most dramatic developments, or three, of the Holocaust are: one, the destruction of most of the Jewish people and culture in Europe; two, the creation of the State of Israel, which might have happened anyway, but might not have; and three, the complete rethinking among Christians of goodwill all over Western and Central Europe, not Eastern Europe because they were under the communists. When I grew up in Northeast Philadelphia living with 50% Catholics, I never went into a church. And no Catholics ever came into my synagogue. Since 1965 and afterwards, everything is like this. None of it was like that before. That's part of the impact of the Holocaust and the rethinking of the meaning of life and ultimate reality. So how do things get even worse? Could they get worse? They get worse. Any scientists here, if you dare raise your hand? Origin of Species, 1859. Descent of Man, 1870. Survival of the Fittest, evolution. And social Darwinism, survival of the fittest even more. Darwin didn't want it to be applied to human living. He was just explaining how the biological world developed. But by the middle and second half of the 19th century, the struggle for survival and the survival of the fittest became normative ways about thinking of reality. And beginning in the 1850s, you get Gobineau, a French aristocrat, who writes 3 essays on the origins of inequality among the races. And from the development of modern anthropology, linguistics, and biological sciences, you get the development of modern racism. Now, Bismarck, who is the greatest leader of 19th century Germany and perhaps the greatest diplomat of the whole 19th century, Bismarck says that if you want to have the perfect racial creature, you marry a German thoroughbred with a Jewish mare. Of course, the German's on top. So he thinks the Jews are a pretty strong race. Okay? They were extremely important in the development of modern Germany. His financier was Jewish. His closest confidant was Jewish. Bismarck didn't confide in anyone, but the Jew would never have any power other than his relationship with Bismarck, so he could confide in his own Jew. Everyone had their own Jew. If you were a leader, they all had Jewish bankers. But you get the development of 19th century pseudoscientific racial anti-Semitism, and the word is in fact coined in 1879 by a German thinker called Wilhelm Marr. And according to Marr and the hundreds of other racial theorists, the human species is divided into separate races. And each race has separate characteristics. Physical, but far more important, because there can be mistakes in the physical, essential. Aryans are essentially loyal, courageous, spirited, brave, honest. Jews are essentially disloyal, cowardly, sneaky, greedy, and nasty. Aryans on top, Latins next, Slavic people not good for much, not much intelligence there. Asians and Africans down, and all men over all women everywhere. Because women's brains are smaller, guys. They're just not as smart as we are. Racially, biologically, they don't have the same capability until you compete with them. Then you find out. And the Japanese never do anything creative. This goes into the 1960s. Nobody bought the original Toyotas, right? Because all they do is imitate. Well, that's pretty smart to imitate. That's how you learn. Isn't that how we all learn? We imitate. So all those Japanese taking pictures of the Parisian fashions in the 1950s and 60s are imitating. They bring it back to Japan and do what they... How did the French industrialize? They stole it from the British. How did the Russians industrialize? They borrowed it from the French and the British and the Germans. You imitate. These characteristics become the accepted belief system of late 19th century Europe. In addition to which, the struggle for survival becomes part of the general belief system of late 19th century Europe. What does the most superior culture do? And how does it prove itself? It goes to war. And the superior race will survive. Okay? The superior race will prevail. You have imperialism. How do the whites justify their behavior? They're taking superior civilization and the good book to the natives. The natives get the good book, the whites get the land. It's a great trade. Okay? Imperialism is justified. Slavery is justified, even when they get rid of it over time. And this is the time period in the 1860s, worldwide. Anti-feminism, pushing down on women, reacting against them when the suffragette movement and the feminist movements develop in the late 19th century. The rebellion against the confinement of urban life. All the rebellions against the confinement of urban life. Who is the symbol of urban life? The Jew is the symbol of modern urban life. The group that did the best in modern urban life. Whether it was Berlin or Vienna or Paris. Among others, they start becoming professors. They start becoming journalists. They start becoming playwrights. They start affecting European culture. This is the time period of Durkheim, Einstein, Freud, Bergson, Schoenberg, Mahler. Mahler, to lead the Viennese Symphony, has to convert to Catholicism. In Paris, it wasn't necessary. In Germany and Austria, it was. In Russia at the same time, you had radical pogroms, riots against Jews, anti-Jewish legislation, expulsions. The Grand Duke gives the Tsar as the birthday, expelling all the Jews from St. Petersburg. They get 2 weeks' notice. And in 1903, a pamphlet is written in Russia, plagiarizing a pamphlet written in the 1860s in France, entitled The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, describing the ways in which elderly Jewish rabbis and economic leaders worldwide meet to figure out how to dominate the world, destroy Christianity, and take over everything and rape and rampage as they will, and it is believed to be true even though it's shown immediately to be a forgery and a plagiarized piece of work. The Tsar believes in it implicitly. When Jews were socialists, the capitalists hated them for being socialists. When Jews were capitalists, the left hated them for being capitalists. When Jews were nationalists, the internationalists hated the Jews for being nationalists, which most Jews were. And when Jews were internationalists, they were hated for being internationalists by the nationalists. The Jew had become the other upon which you posit all of your psychological illness and self-loathing. The Jew in Europe was the African American in the United States in this time period of incredible cultural turmoil. And at the same time, except in Eastern Europe, in Western and Central Europe, day by day, week by week, Jews were living better, doing better, learning better, producing better, contributing more, and feeling confident that the world was at their hands. Except for Theodor Herzl and some other few in Western Europe who came to the conclusion during the Dreyfus Affair that this just can't continue and Jews had better find a place to live of their own. And that's why the Zionist movement begins in late 19th century France during the Dreyfus Affair, when the first Jewish officer on the French general staff is accused of treason and convicted 3 times on forged evidence and illegal Jewish procedures, judicial procedures. And it's 100 years after Jews get equality in France, and when he is defrocked of his medals and his clothing, the crowds scream, "À bas les Juifs," down with the Jews, and there are anti-Jewish riots all over France. 100 years after gaining political liberty. The word was heureuse comme Dieu en France. The Jews were happy as God in France. They loved that country so much. And the German Jews felt exactly the same way. They had become far more French and far more Jewish than they were Jews, but to most people, they still were the other. Now, let me stop. Should I stop or should I talk about how did the Jews survive?
Talk about how the Jews.
I don't know. Okay, how did they survive? Yeah, let's have 10 minutes of questions and then we'll go to that. Good, George.
Could you just explain the feudal area again, why you said the Jews didn't fit into the feudal era?
The whole feudal era is based on Christian oaths. You take fealty to your superior. The smaller lord to the larger lord, the larger lord to the larger lord, the larger lord to the king. All based on an oath. The oath is Christian. The Jews can't be part of it. Therefore, they are kept out of all areas of the economy associated with feudalism, including all urban art crafts, unions, anything apprenticed, and they're pushed into selling used goods in many respects and lending money because the church was against using usury. And then during the Renaissance, that weakens and you get the beginning of widespread, larger Christian banking, and then they are competing with the Jews in those industries also, so they also in many cases want them expelled to get rid of the competition. But the Jews still really, really excel in banking because they're international. They have contacts internationally. Other questions? Yes. Grégoire!
I believe you said you were going to touch on the diaspora.
This is my guy, Greg. I taught his father 41 years ago. Tommy Lacana, head of ROTC at Lafayette College. Greg walks into my class with his beautiful beard, and the first thing I said to him is, Greg, what's your dad think about your beard? Do you remember that? Yes. Then he shaves his beard one day, and it's his dad's face. Go ahead, sorry.
I believe you were going to touch on this, it may still be to come, but from the Jews out of Palestine, across Europe, how that...
Okay, well, one way the Jews survived, and that's exactly it. One way the Jews survived were the wandering Jew. Yeah, they wandered. And as one great author, Howard Sacker, said, fortunately, when they were about to be destroyed or expelled from one place, luckily there was another place for them to go. And what they took with them was their portable temple, their Torah, their law books, their Talmud codes. And they established a new institution, synagogues, wherever they went. The first thing they did is have a cemetery, then they had a synagogue, then they had a school, and they continued their learning. And instead of animal sacrifice in the temple, they had weekly services, okay, and study of the text. And in Judaism, the study of the text is an act of prayer. And when you think that way, and the study of the text begins when you're 4 and 5 years old, when you study secular text, if you have come from a traditional background, that also, in a way, becomes an act of prayer. It is completely natural. And to study the Jewish text, you have to be multilingual. So it's all multilingual, and it's all interpretive. And the peculiar quality of those texts is that in many cases, there is no right or wrong answer. There are 15 different opinions. One Jew, 2 opinions. In other words, it's all preparation for modern legal thinking. And the texts are as long as from wall to wall. And you memorize the text. And in Eastern Europe even, where my family came from, the kids began at age 5. And by age 10, they had memorized the Bible. And then they go to the code laws. And they memorize it. And they debate it. And they argue over it. And it's like mental gymnastics. And it really prepares you for the modern world. Or it prepares you to remain in the ancient world and to reject the whole modern world. Okay? But you take any of those little children in those long black frocks in New York with their little side curls, and you give them 1 year to adapt and put them in a regular school, and they can learn anything you give them because they've just spent the last 10 years of their life studying. And in many, many cases, the wife works, the man studies. In many, many cases. And that's what a good marriage is, marrying into a family that can support you so you can be a scholar. It's the honor of the wealthy family to have the scholar as a son-in-law, or it used to be. Used to be, okay? With the Americanization process, that lessened a lot. Yeah.
In Jewish philosophy, the Sadducees and the Pharisees,
Okay.
they still, one sect still believe in heaven, the hereafter.
Yes, the Pharisees believed in heaven and the hereafter. Jesus was a left-wing Pharisee in the tradition of Isaiah and the prophets. Okay? When I study Christianity, or Islam for that matter, most of it is so clear to me from Judaism. When I go to a church, and the more traditional the church is, the closer it is to Judaism, including the whole Eastern Orthodox churches. But Pharisaic Judaism in the first century is supplanting the Sadducees, who are more literalists, and the Pharisees are more interpreters. But later, Christianity is breaking away from the Pharisees, so they make Jesus an anti-Pharisee. He's not. Okay? And all these books tell me that. I always felt that he was within the Jewish religious tradition. We can't know. Jesus left no writings. We can't know what he truly believed. We can't know what he really thought he was. What we do know is that he really comes from the prophetic side of Judaism. Okay? I don't want your burnt sacrifices, I want your charity. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Take care of the widow, take care of the stranger, take care of the orphan. Take care of the leper. Okay? That's left-wing Judaism. That's why Jews get involved in revolutions.
Well, modern Judaism, does it
Modern Judaism is just like modern Christianity. It goes all the way from the left to all the way to the right. And in America, of course, most of it has been more toward the left. So in the last election, Jews still voted 70% for Mr. Obama with great hope. Okay? And still will, probably 65, 70%. And a lot of that is because of always being on the other side of the battle underneath. So as a group, Jews, more than any other group, vote against their economic self-interest as people of greater wealth, because they believe that, among other things, that the health of the general society is more important than anything else, and there will always be room for them as long as the general society is healthy. And when the general society becomes less healthy, there's not going to be any place for them, and they're the first one that sticks out. Or in America, it's other groups who stick out. Okay? If there had not been African Americans and Asian Americans, it would have been the Jews in America on some level as well who would have stuck out. Other groups absorbed most of the psychological illnesses associated with lack of self-acceptance. And so the Jews had it easier here, except in the 20s and 30s, when they needed the help the most, and then they were the outcasts. And we'll get to that, okay? But, for example, there was no discussion about whether Jews should have been equal citizens. It was by 1776, 1783, 1787, accepted. The Jews wrote to Washington saying, thank you for this and that and the other, and he wrote back to them saying, don't thank me. These are your inalienable rights. You're not here by toleration. You just have just as much right here as anybody else. And that remained relatively true until the late 19th century, when the old American elite felt overwhelmed by immigrants, Italian and Jewish immigrants. And then there was a backlash. But the backlash came first against the Asians. It was already there against the blacks, then against the Jews and the Italians, Catholics and Jews. And then we got immigration laws, okay? which is the worst single thing that ever happened to Jews in American history, the immigration laws, because that's why, among other reasons, they got stuck in Europe, because we wouldn't take them. Okay, so how did the Jews survive, right? You want more on that?
Well, maybe this is a sub-part that I was going to ask. When did the Jews leave Palestine, and what was the early history of the diaspora?
Okay, when did the Jews leave Palestine? Every time it was destroyed. How many times was it destroyed? Okay, it was destroyed in 722 by the Assyrians, right? Where'd they go? We don't know. They died. Okay, so the northern kingdoms, the wealthier kingdoms, disappeared. The kingdoms of Israel, the 10 tribes of Israel, as we say, garnished, nothing left. 12, well, 10 northern, 2 southern. Okay, so the Judah, 586, first temple destroyed. They went to Babel. They went to Babylonia. They went to Iraq and Iran. They go back to Iran 2,500 years. They go back to Babylonia 2,500 years. Okay, Iraq and Iran. And they establish academies. The Persians conquer it, the Iranians. They give the Jews more freedom. They let them return. They return. But most Jews stay. Okay? But some return. They rebuild their temple. The temple is destroyed again in 70. Where do they go? They're in Rome. They're in Cairo. They're in Alexandria. They're in India and China sometime during this period. India and China. Indian and Chinese Jews. They're all over the world. They're in France. They're all over North Africa. But the greatest center remains Iraq until the 10th century. Then it switches to Spain. Then it switches to Turkey and Poland. Then they get pushed. Then,
Pardon?
I mean, in large numbers?
in large numbers.
Oh.
Because the kings and the popes, the Catholics in Poland, want to develop their civilization. And the Jews are the core of the economy. So they invite the Jews from Western Europe, where they're being expelled, to come to Poland under protection. And so in 1800, there are about 1 million Jews in Poland. Peru with our arts, be fruitful and multiply and fulfill the land. So they peru. By 1900, there's 6 million. The population goes up 6 times. What do you think these Orthodox people do on Saturday? It's a mitzvah. It's a commandment and a good deed to have sex on Shabbos. You have children. Okay? The more children, the more you've glorified God. It's a traditional religion on the Orthodox side. So they go from 1 million to 6 million in 100 years. Okay? So basically, and this is crazy, there probably were 5-6 million Jews in the ancient world. On the eve of 1940, there were about 14 million. It's 60, 70 years later, there's still about 14 million. If not for all of this repression, destruction, and forced migration, there would be several 100 million Jews living in the world. This was constant, somewhere, all the time. All the time. Yeah.
Now, at any point during all this history, and I mean all of this history, is there any centralized institution like for the Jews, like we Christians have?
Great. Yep.
Papacy?
No.
No.
What there were is rabbinic centers. And there's a whole question and answer responsa literature. Questions. Questions are sacrosanct. So there would be, it would be known that the rabbis in Iraq or the rabbi in France or the rabbi in Germany was the senior scholar worldwide, or there were 3 of them recognized. And you would send them questions, and they would write back 30-page responses. And sometimes the response was accepted, and sometimes the response was not accepted. So you get these universal geniuses. In Iraq, Saadia Gaon, 892 to 942, first codified prayer books. 11th century France, Rashi, commentaries on the whole Bible and on the whole Talmud. The best commentaries everywhere, anywhere. Pope studied his commentaries to understand what they called the Old Testament, okay? And we call the Hebrew Scriptures. Maimonides, next century. Every century had particular giants. Again, as a portent for the future. The giant of the 17th century is Spinoza. And he gets excommunicated because Spinoza is a pantheist. And the Jews excommunicated heretics just like the Christians excommunicated heretics. And the Jews didn't just take all of this laying back on their backs. They clearly continue to think of themselves as the chosen people. So the one thing that didn't happen to them through all of this is they never thought lesser than. And that is another reason for the capability to survive and be successful. Their tradition taught them that they remained God's holy people who had custodianship of the truth. And I remember about age 15 when I began to understand part of this, because I loved history, and I turned one day and I said to God, do me a favor. First of all, I'm not chosen because my friends who are Christian are just as good as I am, and my neighbors and my aunts. And secondly, choose someone else. Okay? And that's Jewish humor. Because we're allowed to struggle with our texts. In the Haggadah for Passover, on the last page, before we sing Lishana Haba'ah B'Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem, Lishana Haba'ah, Lishana Haba'ah, Lishana Haba'ah B'Yerushalayim. Whoa! There's a sentence that says, Shafot chamatcha al hagoyim asher lo yida'ucha. Pour out your wrath on the nations who knew you not. So the Jews got back. They cursed anyone who cursed them. I tore it out of my prayer book. I cut it out when I was 14 or 15, and I explained why I was doing it to my great uncle, Jack, who was the wealthiest member of the family, who saved the family by bringing them over from Poland. Why I had decided to cut it out of my prayer book. Okay? Because in America it doesn't fit. Even though there was enormous anti-Semitism in our schools and neighborhood, it didn't fit, it didn't work. I cut it out. So Jews got back, not by poisoning wells and taking the blood, but by saying, you people are behaving like animals, you're animals. Okay, cool. We don't behave that way, right? We study our books. We do our thing. We try to get through life. We wait for the Messiah. The modern industrial world got rid of most of that for most Jews also. And we live in a confused, tormented state of existential being because there are no truths. Absolute truths, yes.
If Jews are the chosen people, why did the Lord allow the Holocaust to happen?
Okay, well that is the reason, among many, many other reasons, that most Jews reject that whole concept of chosenness. Jews are not the chosen people. There is no chosen people. If Jews are the chosen people, why are there 1.4 billion Chinese people and only 14 million Jews? Why are there 1 billion Indian people? If Jewish and Christian civilization is superior, why are there 1.4 billion Chinese who don't? You know what they're doing in South Korea now? They're having their children study Talmud. In South Korea, they made Talmud study part of the curriculum because they wanted to figure out why Jews loved learning so much, and Jews study the Talmud. So Orthodox Jews still believe they are the chosen people. Most Jews have given that back in America, where everybody is equal and where everyone has access to God, if you believe in God. And chosenness has gone by the wayside. But the concept of chosenness is one of the things that enabled the Jews to survive. The Sabbath is one of the things that enabled the Jews to survive. The Torah and study, the family, the wider community, and the whole transnational structure of Jewish life. One of the favorite medieval games was called Ransom a Rabbi. You take a rabbi and you say, all right, pay up. You don't get your rabbi back until you ransom him. And Jews from all over the world send in money to get the rabbi free. There were all kinds of games. So Jews became a multinational, transnational people worldwide. And that's another reason why they had success in international commerce, because all they had to do was shake hands on a deal. They didn't have to write a contract. And you broke that deal, your name was gone. Okay? But in terms of chosenness, I can't answer that question, which is one of the reasons that, to me, chosenness was a non-starter for me from the time I was a kid. It just doesn't make any sense. We call the Jews choosing people. We chose to survive. We chose to study our texts. We chose to follow our traditions. So we take the passive chosen and make it the active choosing, because it's all voluntary anyway today. We choose to do it, not because we have to, but because we want to. It helps make life meaningful in a world where there's not all that much meaning.
So you teach philosophy too?
I don't teach it, but I think about it. Yeah.
Because when a non-Jewish person hears that, and even a Jewish person, that we're the chosen people, it makes it feel like we're like above everybody else. We're like special. But we are in a sense that we're obligated to do certain things as Jews. And we have responsibilities with that title, chosen people.
Okay, the way the rabbis interpreted chosenness was not superiority, but responsibility. Okay? We have greater obligation to teach, to observe certain laws and to live in a certain way. Jews, the traditional definition by the rabbis, God did not choose the Jews because they were larger. God did not choose the Jews because they were more powerful. God did not choose the Jews because they were more intelligent. He chose the Jews because they accepted the law. And all the other nations who God asked didn't want to accept the law. The Jews accepted it. They said, Na'aseh v'nishma, we will listen and we will do. We will obey. Okay? And in taking on that contract, they were obliged to do certain things thereafter. That is the traditional way of viewing religion. Christianity saw itself as the supersessor replacement to that until Vatican II and afterwards, in which we finally accepted that if there is something called heaven, there are many, many ways to get there. Can you conceive of all of those Chinese and Indian people and Africans not being able to get to heaven if there's a heaven? Is that feasible? All those Japanese people living isolated in the world for hundreds of years couldn't get to heaven because they didn't have Judaism or Christianity? That doesn't make sense. Okay, so all of these books talk about multiple revelations and multiple ways to get to heaven, and the most important thing is how we live anyway. The most important thing is how we treat each other and how we live. And if we do that decently, we create a little bit of heaven on earth. And that's what Father Charlie and Reverend John and Javad Tavakoli and I have tried to do at Lafayette College, to create a little bit of heaven on earth. You come to our Hillel Society on Friday night, everybody from every part of campus will be there for a free dinner, sitting and talking and joking and having fun together. Okay? And I even change the prayers. There's a prayer, sanctification Kiddush. And in the Kiddush, as it is said traditionally, it says, Kivanu v'charta v'yotanu kidashta, because we you have chosen and we you have made holy, mikol ha'amim, from all the other people. And I changed the mikol ha'amim to im kol ha'amim, with all of the other people. Because I can't say a prayer in the middle of people who are not Jewish and say that I am more sacred than they are. No, no. We have to go back to our texts and revise them to live together. We have to do that. To me, that's sacred work.
Expressing my opinion, an enlightened liberal view.
Right.
I'm sure there are Jews who are still in the position of chosen and
Absolutely.
just as within the Christian faith.
Absolutely.
There are those who would say, I can't explain why all those Chinese and such won't be going to heaven. But they don't.
But they don't.
So
That's it, right?
what would be the, would you think, is your position in the majority, minority, or down the middle? Or,
I don't know that most people even think about these things, but I began when I was about 12, 13 years old and I guess it's one of the reasons I didn't become a rabbi and became a faculty member instead. But there are rabbinical seminaries where this is the common assumption, what I've just maintained, okay? And we talk about God, we talk about godliness instead of about God. We talk about the force of creativity in the universe instead of the absolute king ruler with a beard sitting on a throne. But we all need images. We can't exist without images. So of course, what do we think? We think of these images. Among liberal Jews, you're going to get more of this sensibility. Certainly since the Holocaust. Certainly since the Holocaust. Among Jewish faculty, that's almost absolute. Almost absolute. Among many, many, many rabbis, that's the way they think. Because what's happened, and this is the extraordinary thing, if you go to most rabbis in the United States, among their 5 best friends are the local priest and local minister. That didn't happen 50 years ago. It just didn't happen. Because the rabbis and the priests and the ministers are in the same game against so many of the others who are against the whole game. Okay? So Father and Charlie and I we became like this. And not just Father Charlie, a priest at Boston College. We sat together on the same panel, and Father Frank said to me, Frank said to me, my God, the most important thing that happened at this conference is we met each other. Okay, because we both have the same concerns about life and reality and history and how do you understand all these things. So that's everywhere. You know, I mean, whether it was Mark Schrager here who you knew, or they make the closest friends with these other people immediately. And that's, Reverend John, our chaplain, our general chaplain, exactly the same thing. First thing he does when he comes to campus, he goes out to meet the other clergy. We respect each other inherently. We're doing the same thing. We're thinking the same thoughts. We have certain particular things we disagree about. But most of them are much more liberal than you think they are, and much more questioning of their tradition than you think they are. It's just that in Judaism, that questioning is up front. Okay, I will say things up front that many of them just won't say. Okay, I will just say those things because we've been battered more. I mean, there's a scholar named Richard Rubinstein, one of the most brilliant rabbis of the last generation, and he said in a book called After Auschwitz, how can these kind of things be said anymore? After Auschwitz. 1.5 million children killed? What do you do with that? What world with an ultimate constrained purpose of a God who acts in history? Oh, great. What about the 20 million Chinese who starved to death during the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s? We just don't know about them. We don't think about them. They're not ours. They're just Chinese. So, I mean, these are the things that throw us these curveballs. And not everybody reaches the same conclusions, and we must respect each other's conclusions. That's one of the reasons I don't love to lecture about these things, because it gets me into the ultimate reality. I can't avoid it. And I don't do this with students a lot unless they push me to it. And then we talk about it. Other questions? All right, let's take a break then. Good.